So what I'll be discussing today is touching on topics that were in the Chapter 8 PowerPoint, drug use and addiction. I will kind of specifically be talking about the section that was, I think it was called drug taking as deviant, where it kind of talks about that a drug kind of being defined as deviant, or like the way that it's labeled is more of a it's constructed by society. These things are defined and labeled socially. And I think that's very interesting. Another thing that stated was how there is nothing really that distinguishes drug use from being deviant or non-deviant. It's, there is no deviant drug, like non-deviant drug use. If drug use is just labeled deviant. And going back to how drug use and the deviance that comes from it is constructed socially, something that I really think about is, I know is one of the examples brought up in the PowerPoint when it talks about cocaine. I think in the PowerPoint it talked about how, like, in the 1850s, cocaine was, seen as like a normal thing to use in society, right? And I had read a book and it talked about how, for example, people, like very intelligent people, like, for example, Sigmund Freud, he had written a lot of papers talking about the good effects and the medicinal effects of cocaine, especially as a way to get rid of opium addiction. There was a lot of people addicted with opium, and he wanted to use that as a way to use cocaine as a way for people to get off of opium. And you see ads everywhere about cocaine, doctors everywhere prescribing cocaine. And it's crazy, in the book it talked about how doctors and medical practitioners were actually more likely to be addicted to cocaine than the people that they were prescribing it to. And kind of just went off on a tangent there. I just really think that's crazy. But kind of going back to how society shapes drug use and the labeling of deviant behavior through the drug use, it kind of goes to show how, something like marijuana, we can talk about marijuana, how before it went through a period of, okay, like, yes, this is fine, it's no big deal. And then I think it was like the 1950s, I think it was like 1955 or something, when it was the Harrison Act. Could be getting that wrong, I apologize. That kind of really, labeled marijuana as a Schedule I drug. And then ever since then, there's been this whole stigma behind it. And then we get into the 2000s, and especially now the 2010s, and even the 2020s that we're in right now, you really see that label really shifting in how people perceive it. To me, it's just really interesting. I don't know, just how as a society, the whole, even though, there's different sanctions that get placed on people and different punishments placed on people for doing certain drugs, obviously, you have things like caffeine and alcohol, which are drugs but are socially acceptable, unless you, I guess, besides caffeine, like if you take it too far, like alcohol, you're labeled an alcoholic, and that's a problem, obviously. But I don't know, just that interplay of how if you take drugs, it is seen as a deviant action no matter what. And we, as the people, label and put each other in these boxes for what substances we take, whether that be top down from the government, labeling these drugs Schedule I drugs and, making them illegal. You can face very long prison sentences for stuff like that, or bottom up to where, society will be like, oh, you're taking this or you're taking this, like, you must be this kind of person, you must be that kind of person. It's very interesting, especially seeing how that is kind to start, it's kind of starting to collapse. And I believe that it kind of will continue to collapse. Those kinds of notions that if you take drugs, you're a deviant and all this other kind of stuff, you kind of see it. And it's a double-edged sword, because you go to places like, what's called, like, Philly. There's like a couple blocks where people are just taking this drug called Trank, and it's literally just people just drugged out. You just see them all across the block, and it's really depressing and sad to see. And that's what I mean, that it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because when you, to a certain extent, when you stop labeling these drugs as deviant, it leads, it kind of gives people the doorway to do whatever they want with these drugs. And, I am kind of more liberal in the regard of drug use. I feel like if you're a consenting adult, you should kind of be able to put whatever you want in your body, just if you know the consequences. But some things aren't meant for everybody. And I feel like that's where things can get a little murky. But anyways, that whole chapter 8, very interested in stuff like that. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.